Welcome to Mio on MMA. I am Mio, aka Mike, and I'm the host for your next hour or so here. Initially, I was thinking this would maybe be a podcast that ended up on places other than Acast and YouTube. That will not be the case. It's on Acast and YouTube, at least at the time of recording this. That's the plan. It may in the future end up on other platforms, but so no changes at the moment. We're coming off a pretty good card. UFC on UFC Fight Night, Błachowicz versus Rakić. It was a pretty good card. It was meaningful, exciting, revealing on a number of different prospects and fighters. Not without its own fair share of controversy, particularly in regards to the comments made by one corner during the fights, and we'll talk about that in depth and why I'm not surprised. Not really on the side of the entirely enraged side of the community, just because MMA is kind of rife with such sentiments, and it does feel like kind of a waste of energy to get really worked up about it. But at the same time, I also think that the people defending the corner in question are, I'm not sure what is more likely. Ignorant, disingenuous, or harboring their own controversial views on the topic. But we'll talk about that more in depth. It was also a fight card where my old friend, a lack of fight IQ and a lack of game plan specific to an opponent really came into play, particularly regarding the clinch. Now, I feel like I'm going to have to say this because I'm going to say of a number of fighters on this card that lost that their unwillingness to avoid the clinch was a part of their downfall. Now, I want to say this. When I say avoiding the clinch, I'm not in any way suggesting that a fighter can just make that conscious decision to not clinch and the opponent has nothing to do with the process, that the opponent cannot force the clinch upon them. What I am saying is that not that those fighters ended up in the clinch, but that those fighters, in some cases, initiated the clinch, and in all cases, when I bring this up, didn't seem to have any particular game plan, ideas, techniques to avoid the clinch. And for the most part, I think it comes down to, we've seen in MMA that there is a history of not really game planning for the opponent. It's you go out there and you have your fight. If your fight happens to involve the clinch, then you will clinch. If your game plan involves taking the opponent down, you will do that. Perhaps the best example of this is probably Nikita Krylov versus Paul Craig. A fight in which, on paper, Krylov should not have lost. More athletic fighter, faster, stronger, better striker, more explosive, more dynamic, more creative on the feet. The path to victory for Krylov was very obvious. Do not go to the ground with Paul Craig. Do not wrestle him. If he tries to wrestle you, create separation, land power shots. Very simple thing. People have done it to Craig a couple of times. There's pretty much the hallmark of every loss he has is just don't go to the ground with him. And Krylov, who was not a bad grappler by any means, but not a very good one. And keep in mind that Craig's game is almost entirely grappling. Went out there and pretty much immediately took Paul Craig down and got submitted. That's probably the classic example of this, of just, it's not that you can just decide to not grapple with Paul Craig. That's not what I'm suggesting. But it's the fact that a fighter had no game plan to avoid it. And that was kind of the thing here with the clinch in a lot of these fights. Let's start at the top, work our way down. Jan Blehovitz versus Alexander Rakić. This fight was interesting. Not necessarily a barn burner, not necessarily a can't miss thing. But it did reinforce the idea that Jan Blehovitz is one of the few really defensively sound fighters in the UFC's 205 division. He actually has a game plan that seems to actually tailor itself to the opponent. Just talking about how a lot of fighters don't do that. No. Blehovitz he looks at what you do well, and he comes up with ways to try to short circuit what you do well while doing things that he does well. He checks leg kicks very well. He will implement wrestling when he needs to. He will counterpunch when he needs to. He will establish the jab when he can, and he would love to do that every fight, as most fighters would. And he would like to control the range. And there were points when Rakić was getting around that and having good moments. But the big problem probably for Rakić is that his kicking game wasn't nearly as effective or impactful as it normally is. Blehovitz did a very good job of neutralizing that through, like I said, checking the kicks, punishing him through throwing the kicks, and doing a good job of feeling the range and finding his range despite being 3 inches shorter, I believe. 3 inches in height differential. And eventually Rakic's leg blew out. There is some suggestions that it was a pre-existing injury. There are some suggestions, obviously, that it was done from the leg kicks or the checking of leg kicks. We're probably never going to entirely know. Probably a little bit of all of them, I would imagine. An existing knee injury is something a large number of fighters hide and fight through. This, of course, has led to the great debate of, like, are fighters who claim to be injured actually injured? I think the answer is probably yes. I think that it has gone above and beyond the pale at times. Most famously, Tito Ortiz claiming to have a cracked skull, and the UFC medical team being like, he does not, in fact, have a cracked skull. We checked him afterwards. And so it is probably overplayed and oversold to try to make up for a loss. But I wouldn't be surprised if Rakić had some kind of minor knee injury that the course of the fight got worse and eventually resulted in, I haven't seen a medical confirmation on this, but it looked like an ACL tear to me. Not a doctor, just a guy who has had some knee injuries, has seen some knee injuries, and kind of has a rough, very rough idea of what each particular knee injury can look like. So I thought it was an ACL. What's next for Belhovich? Title shot. I think the thing is that, you could argue that, like, this is his first win since losing the title. And you're not wrong. And he's got one win, and it's, slightly wonky, but, like, who else really is there after Yuri Prohaska? Are we really going to give Magomed Ankalaev, the winner of Ankalaev versus Smith, a title shot? Are we really going to give Paul Craig versus Volkan Oezdemir, the winner of that fight, a title shot over Jan Blachowicz? I don't think so. I mean, the only thing I could see maybe stopping it is obviously if we end up with some kind of bizarre scenario with Prohaska versus Teixeira that requires a rematch or something. Obviously, the MMA gods could throw that curveball. But he's the only one that really, right now, makes a ton of sense for that title shot. And this fight should have been treated just full on as a number one contender fight. Again, the UFC doesn't like to do that because they really like to be able to fuck with fighters in terms of contract negotiations and so on. And they fear any leverage the fighters have. So if they declare someone a contender, they have to be able to take it away if they cause any trouble. We'll talk about that more later on. So, moving on down the card. We had Ryan Spawn versus Yonkutalaba. I picked Kutalaba in this fight. He was doing a lot of what I thought he would do. Getting aggressive, making Spawn uncomfortable, out-wrestling him. But then he ended up sticking his head into a guillotine, and there's not really much else to say. He got tapped. Spawn has a very, very deadly guillotine. He has a very deadly front headlock game. I actually think it's the best part of his game. But Ryan Spawn will forever, and I said this in the prediction, will forever be a fighter that I inherently don't trust because he seems very uncomfortable when he's fighting. It's one of those fighters who I kind of 100% wonder what his motivations are for fighting because mixed martial arts doesn't pay well enough. Like, I've heard stories of, like, basketball players, football players, and so on playing the game long after they particularly have enjoyed it. Or getting into the game because it was the only way out of essentially poverty. MMA really shouldn't be treated that way because the money's just not that good. Like if you're not enjoying the MMA career, then I don't know why you do it. And like that's the thing with Spawn that like just will probably never leave me, and why I will probably never entirely trust him is he does not seem to be enjoying himself. What's next? I don't know, because I mean that's again going to my point about Spawn. You know, how interested am I? How good of a feel? How interested am I seeing a guy who I'm not sure likes to be in there? And that's a massive question mark to me. Um, he could fight someone like Dominic Reyes, who really needs to kind of refine his way. Spawn has some credibility. It's a fight that I think Reyes can win. It's definitely something to go there. As for Kutalaba, Yonkutalaba is just like essentially just absolute action fighter. You can put him in there with anyone who's going to do action fightery things. I'm looking at the Tapology rankings. He's right next to Jimmy Crute. I would be down with that. I don't believe they have fought previously. So it's a fresh matchup. It's two guys who really like to do a lot of the same things. You could also go the Johnny Walker route with them. So, I mean, there's a lot of options there. And he's going to be probably fairly exciting regardless of what you do. So, you know, it's kind of really all that. There's not much else to add about that fight. Moving on down, Davey Grant versus Louis Smolka. I kind of went like I thought it would, although it did get a finish. I was one of the few people thinking that Smolka would make it to decision, so I was wrong on that. The reason I thought that is that Grant is not a particularly amazing finisher. Yes, he hurts people, but he doesn't usually finish them all that well. He thrives in the chaos of the fight and gets the job done. And in the first round, he was doing everything right. I think he was digging to the body very well. He was varying up his strikes. Smolka's body is very hittable. His legs are very hittable. And then I think he screwed up in the second round because, you know, he had hurt Smolka in the first round. He had really won that first round very clearly. And Smolka came back and had a very good second round because Davey Grant went headhunting. And as much as Smolka has a questionable chin and he's fairly slow, even at bantamweight, he's particularly slow at flyweight. He's still slow at bantamweight. He does guard his head reasonably well. So he was actually defending most of what Grant was doing quite well. And I kind of found his way back in there. And then then in the third round, he hurt him with the leg kick, threw him off balance, and the rest was as it was seen, and we ended up with a pretty cool TKO. Davey Grant said that he really actually wants quick KOs as opposed to wars. And he kind of made my point for me. Like, he's always in wars. And that usually means that you're not a particularly venomous finisher in the early going. I don't have really opponents for either of these guys because I think the book is kind of written on them. Grant is a very high-end action fighter, very exciting, very crowd-pleasing. Didn't get a performance of the night bonus for this somehow. Ryan Spawn got a performance of the night bonus? I don't know about that. Like, to me, Spawn was losing his fight up until getting a guillotine. Grant was winning a fight and then put an exclamation point on it by finishing the fight. I don't get it. I've always had some level of problem with the performance of Night's bonus just because they tend to not really have a tremendous amount of inherent consistent logic to them. So that's a bit of a problem. But yeah, so I feel bad that Grant didn't get the 50K that he probably deserved. I'm trying to remember who got the other performance of the night bonus. The fight of the night went to Shukagian versus Hebus, which we're going to talk about next. And Manuel Torres. Manuel Torres got the other one. Anyways, I didn't have a problem with Torres, but other than that, I thought the bonus awards went to the wrong people. Caitlin Shukagian versus Amanda Hebus. A lot of people are really disappointed that Hebus didn't win this fight. And I don't really understand why. It's not that I don't see a logic for Hebus winning this fight. She won the third round, in my opinion. And you could give her the first two rounds via the head and arm suicide throws that she hit Shukagian with and got a reasonable amount of time on top. Let's see. Do we have a figure? Because I have the stats page up here. Yeah, a total of a total of a little under 5 minutes of top control time between those two. Apparently she had 3 takedowns. I'm not recalling. Oh, she got one in the third, apparently. Okay, yeah. And got like 18 seconds of top control time. Gotcha. Okay, yeah, so 1 takedown per round. Thing is, she didn't do a lot from the top. And the thing to me is that MMA fans have, for the longest time, probably the entire existence of the sport, complained about the idea that the fighter on top wins by virtue of being on top. That, like, takedowns win fights. John Fitch, Rick Story, Mike Pierce, Jacob Volkman, any number of like lay and pray experts. And yet, when the judges make the call to give the fight to the fighter that did more damage, because Chookagian did outstrike Hebus at range in both the first and the second round, and hurt her a little bit, they complain. And of course, this is always the tough one of, like, tracking through social media to find out someone's opinion on every single topic. And obviously, there could be a consistency of these fans. But some of the people that were doing it, I'm pretty sure, have historically not liked that logic for winning fights. And I wonder if it's just like kind of there is a somewhat anti-Chookagian vibe to a fair amount of the fandom. And I get it, because I'm definitely kind of in that boat. Her fights for a long time were quite poor. She's become notably better, and her fights have been much better to look forward to. But she still is a stale face at the top of the division, where there's not a lot of fresh matchups for her. And no, she can talk about the changes she's made and how a title shot might go better. No. Valentina Shevchenko will destroy Caitlin Chookagian if they meet up again. So there is that firm lack of interest. After the fight, she talked about wanting to fight Manon Fiorot, or Fior. I'm fine with that. That's a perfectly fine fight. It does look at something I'm concerned about with Manon, which is what happens if the range game is not entirely hers, and if she is forced to fight in kind of that middle area, the pocket, the mid-range striking. It's a concern of hers, a concern that I have with hers. And what happens if she's forced to fight a striker who will adapt to some of the things she's doing and will get better? And the other thing about the takedowns Hebus was hitting is that she basically spent a lot of her time on top defending her own back. Because, of course, when you do the head and arm throw, you potentially end up with a situation where the person can come out and grab your back. Hebus is actually pretty good at defending that, because she does the extra kind of roll when she does that and ends up in side control, as opposed to where a lot of other fighters end up, which is in essentially with someone on your back. But like, Chookagian was still threatening the back for most of those ground exchanges. It just didn't impress me. If you think Hebus won, I'm not going to consider you crazy or anything, but there was a Hebus got robbed element to social media, which I did not really have any thought about in the ways of positivity. As for what Hebus does next, hopefully back down to strawweight, because at strawweight, I think she's an absolute beast. But I don't know how the weight cut is going. So it'll depend on what she elects to do in that regard as to who we'll see her against next. Manuel Torres knocked out Frank Camacho. It's the unfortunate thing. Camacho starts slow. I think his chin at lightweight isn't very good. He seems more durable at 170, but still has the same problem. And then, of course, has the additional problem of being like a smaller guy. What do I think about Torres? My estimation of him went up a little bit in this fight. I thought some of his defensive striking, head movement in particular, actually looks fairly slick. Because coming into the fight, I really just thought of him as a brawler. There appears to be a little bit more technicality to it. I still don't really think he's going to go that far. I think he's a bit undersized for the weight class. Feels honestly more like a featherweight. And I think there are some massive holes in his game. And I also obviously worry about the fact that almost all of his wins and all the wins I've seen are first round stoppages. So what's the cardio like? What pace can he keep up? What pace is there beyond the first 3 minutes for him? And all of that is really, really problematic. As for who these two guys fight next, the unfortunate thing with Camacho is we know what he is. So put him in there with someone fun. Preferably you won't knock him out in the first round, and that's about it, really. And for Torres, put him in there with someone who's going to take him a little bit further into the fight. So somebody tough, somebody with decent defensive striking who doesn't come out so cold, which shouldn't be hard because Camacho is one of the coldest fighters in the weight class. And have him do his thing there. So there's that. There's no specific name that really comes to mind. Then we have Alan Nascimento beating Jake Hadley. This fight went pretty much exactly what I thought it was going to be. Hadley probably could have won this fight as like a stand-up fight, but as we'll eventually talk about here about going into the clinch quite willingly, it's the same for him. Like, he is going to play in someone's guard. He is going to try to be on top of them. He is going to try to control them. He is going to try to scramble with them. And doing that with Alan Nascimento is not a good idea. He's a very good grappler. His weakness is that he will overly play guard game. He will let fights slip away, basically with the almost Charles Oliveira-like idea that he will get the submission, but without quite that level of venom. And fortunately for him, he was able to get on top of Hadley a couple times. Now, the commentary and also the social media on this were like kind of really, really pro. Oh, Nascimento's kind of fixed everything. I don't think so. He still gave up positions to a still relatively raw fighter and still was controlled for fairly long periods. I don't really feel like he's fixed anything. It's just he was fighting someone who wasn't going to exploit his weaknesses to the same level that Tagir Ulanbekov did. Like, it's just a step down in competition where his style of fighting is going to work. And that's really all it feels like for now. Will he change his game and become better? I hope so. I think that I don't think that the book is closed. I don't really know who he fights next because like the problem with the flyweight division is there just is so few people. So I'm looking for a fun fight for him. You could do Francisco Rivera. Or not Rivera, Figueiredo, pardon me. You could do Bruno Silva. You could do CJ Vergara. You could do Tetsuya Taira, who we're going to talk about in a bit. So there's a lot of options. That'd be fun. Nothing that like specifically comes to mind. As for Jake Hadley, you kind of want someone coming off a loss, so I'm seeing that Cody Durden and JP Buys are booked against each other, so those are two names that did actually come to mind. You could do Clayton Rodriguez, but I think that might be a little bit too high up the ladder. Or Carlos Candelario, who we're going to talk about in a bit. So it's kind of lazy to matchmake off the same card, but I think that would fit the bill. Vivia Rougeo versus Andrea Lee. This is sadly going to be the fight that everyone wants to say about. There's not really a lot of good things coming out of this for KGB Lee. She was coming off one of probably her best performance of all time against Cynthia Calvillo. A fight that a lot of people questioned her ability to win, and I was one of them, and that she went out there and did. She looked cleaner technically. She looked a little faster, probably just from cleaning up the technique a little bit. She looked poised. She looked like she could put a pace on someone. And she looked like she was making a lot of the right strategic fight IQ decisions in the fight. And she did some of that in the first round of this fight. And she hurt Rougeo twice, quite badly. But after that, from a fighting standpoint, she is one of the people who embraced the clinch. Again, I am not saying that she simply just had to say, I am not clinching, and it would have worked. But Rougeo is not necessarily the greatest cut the cage off, footwork, force a grappling game on you. She tends to honestly be more of a counter grappler, where it's like you're willing or even wanting to force a grappling game on her, and you find out that it's way harder than it seems to be. So Lee, who is a good clinch fighter, wasn't afraid of the clinch as much as she probably should have been, and she got dragged down time and time again. Back control, punishment, a lot of chokeholds that obviously weren't necessarily close to finishing the fight, but at the end of the second round, she did say she felt like fasting out, probably from having been in a chokehold for like 90 seconds of that second round. So it definitely paid dividends. And of course, there is the great problem of the Tony Kelly dirty Brazilian line. I am going to say this. Is there a way to interpret Tony Kelly's words as not racist? Sure. I mean, obviously, there's the people who don't consider Brazilians to be a race. But to them, if that's your sole argument, I would like to say, is that actually any better? I've always said this, like, because we get into this like a lot of the time with like, well, that's not racist. They're referring to a country. Okay, but then you're generalizing about someone based on where they were born. Okay, so based on skin tone, based on when they were born, these are all arbitrary reasons to dislike or make assumptions about a fighter. So either way, not good. There are people who say, no, he didn't really mean anything anti-Brazilian or anti-racist about it. He was describing her as a Brazilian and that she was dirty. They were like, not necessarily linked, but then why say she's Brazilian? And also this kind of lines up with some other Twitter and otherwise things about Tony Kelly that we probably really wanted to forget or didn't necessarily know. I've been following Tony Kelly's career for like a long time. So way back when, there was a show called MTV Caged, which was an MMA reality TV show. It was like a trashier version of The Ultimate Fighter because they weren't even in the house. It was the dumbasses from The Ultimate Fighter, the Julian Lanes, the Chris Liebens, and so on, but living their life and making terrible decisions in a lot of ways in Louisiana. And he was one of them. Matt Schnell, also in the UFC, was one of them. Now, Matt Schnell and Tony Kelly were probably some of the better people on the show, if we're being honest, because Wesley and Dan were just absolute train wrecks that I have no faith that their lives turned out well adjusted. But I watched the show because it was a way to get an extra hour of TV time. My family had one TV. We had 3 kids fighting for the TV. And if you could trick one of your siblings, in my case, my sister, into using her time up to watch MTV's Caged, you got some extra fighting. And while the drama and the drama was absolutely mind-numbing, you still got some fights and you kind of went home happy. And during the show, basically, Tony Kelly clearly comes off as a man who has incredible impulse control issues and doesn't have any niceties of political correctness. He's the type of guy who would, for example, believe that all Brazilian fighters are dirty fighters, which is weird because he actually has never fought a Brazilian fighter, so it's a bit weird where that might have come from. That's kind of the more interesting thing. So I'm not surprised he would say something like this. He has said things like this in the past. He is also an anti-vax guy, conspiracy theorist guy, so on. what he says is never going to be amazing. And it's kind of why when people were hailing him as like a savior for Andrea Lee, like a solid upgrade from her ex-husband, my response was very lukewarm. He's an upgrade, but he's an upgrade because almost anyone would be an upgrade from the ex-husband. The ex-husband beat her. I mean, it's a really low bar to cross, and sure, he does meet it. But at the same time, he's... Excuse me, I might have to sneeze. Anyways, he's still an idiot. And again, also was part of like the same kind of general circle of associates that the ex-husband was part of. So anyone who thinks that this is not a pattern or whatever probably needs to rethink it. The defenders of him, I'm not really sure what you're trying to defend necessarily. As I've said a number of times, this is the UFC. Such comments by him are not going to negatively impact his career. They, in fact, helped Colby Covington's career. And so he's not going to find, he's not going to get cut. Dana's probably not going to say anything about it. He's going to probably just give some tired line about freedom of speech, but we will take your flags away when you're trying to make a political statement. And that's really about it. And it's not going to affect his personal life because the people around him have stuck with him through, frankly, worse. And things that, like this, he's not apologized for. I don't think KGB Lee is going to leave him over this or anything like that. Because I think her type is politically incorrect bad boy, frankly. And his fight with Adrian Yanez has incurred a much larger following, hype. There's a lot of people talking about it in a manner that is appealing, whereas before the talk about it was really just that it was kind of bizarre that Adrian Yanez had beaten Davy Grant only to get a guy who fights rather similar to Davy Grant and Tony Kelly and has achieved less. So if anything, it's good for his career. So I don't really know why anyone's defending him. There are people talking about like, oh, we want consistency. You guys weren't against Colby Covington doing this, or Thug Rose is better dead than red thing. No, the people who are worked up or not really on board with Tony Kelly's words about Brazilians were also, in general, there may be exceptions, but in general, we're not on board with Colby Covington's gimmick or with Thug Rose's better dead than red. The same people who were offended by any of those three are probably offended by all of those three. And the people going to bat for any of those three are going to bat for any of those three. Like, there is a fair amount of consistency here. Like it or not, I mean, Conor McGregor is the biggest MMA star, made some incredibly racially insensitive remarks, questionable remarks, both in the lead up to the Jose Aldo and to the Floyd Mayweather fights. There's a segment of the fan base that is on board with this, and it's disturbingly large. But it probably doesn't include the guys who are journalists who are talking about this and deeming it, for example, unacceptable. There we go. That's my 2 cents on the matter. He's not being canceled, so stop saying cancel culture. Vivia Rougeo. Thing is, she's 35 years old. She is kind of her final form, so to speak. And that final form lost to Jessica in 2019 and Chookagian in 2021. So kind of what do you do with her at this point? You know, if she hasn't fought Jennifer Maia, you could do that. Or you could, I guess, maybe do Alexa Grasso if you want to risk Grasso's momentum towards the title shot. It'd be a decent fight. I am sorry. I'm really stuffed up right now, and I don't know why. As for KGB Lee, Joanne Calderwood, maybe? I don't think they fought. Maybe they have. Oh, she did. She lost to Joanne Calderwood. You could do a rematch. I don't think that's even necessarily a problem. But if you want a fresh face, Miranda Maverick, maybe. Or maybe a step up for Tracy Cortez. Or here's an idea. If the UFC goes out and signs Juliana Velasquez, that could be a really fun fight. So let's put those as good options and move on to the next fight, which is Michael Johnson versus Alan Patrick. I really don't have much to say about this fight because I really don't have much to say about either fighter. Johnson is an incredibly uncomfortable grappler, and Patrick is an incredibly uncomfortable striker, and largely this fight stayed standing, and Michael Johnson won. I don't really have anything else to say. I think both are horrendously flawed, and at their current ages, I don't think they're ever going to fix them. So, I don't know. Put them in fights that are kind of interesting and move on with your life. Verna Jandiroba versus Angela Hill. This is one of the ones that is another one of those clinch ones I talk about. Like, Angela Hill is a pretty good clinch fighter. And she will fight pretty much everyone. Like, it doesn't matter who she's fought. She has been willing to clinch with them. She has gotten things done in the clinch. But in this fight with Verna Jandiroba, she should have avoided the clinch like a plague. Because what was the one thing that was going bad for her? She was getting taken down. She was doing actually better than I thought on the ground, actually. She threatened for some things. She had Jandiroba on the defensive a couple of times on the ground. But she was losing on the ground. Jandiroba was on top. She was landing the better strikes. She was in control of the fight when it hit the mat. And while Angela Hill was doing actually fairly well in the clinch, it does set up takedowns. It means that Jandiroba is close enough to apply her wrestling, her takedown game, get you down. Angela Hill would have been better off keeping this at far, far range, but she doesn't necessarily game plan like that, and I do kind of regret picking her in the fight. I may have had a homer bag here where, to be honest, this should have smelled like a fight that Angela Hill loses, and I should have picked Jandiroba. Not much else to say about that. Jandiroba's striking is getting better every time out. Like, I appreciate that she's getting better as a fighter and making the improvements that you want to see, which is very cool. I don't know if there's a matchup I'm really dying to see. You could do Amanda Lemos. You could do Tisha Torres. You could do Lupita Godinez, but I really want to see Lupita Godinez versus Luana Pinheiro. My heart is set on that fight. Make that fight happen. And a fight with Tatiana Suarez, if she ever could get healthy, would be, I think, amazing. But Suarez hasn't fought since 2019. I'm not sure it's going to happen. And for Angela Hill, just give her something she can win. I think it's honestly what it just comes down to. I don't like seeing her lose, is what it comes down to, and we've seen her lose a fair bit. Problem is she's still relatively highly ranked, so she's not going to get an easy fight. Maybe you go with someone like Kenako Murata, or the loser of Jessica Penne versus Brianna Fortino, or maybe the winner of Poliana Viana versus Tabitha Ricci, or the loser of that fight. So, I mean, I guess there's a fair number of options there, but she's another one that she's been getting better, but I think at the end of the day, she's probably still actually kind of the same flawed fighter that was there at the beginning. It's just the strengths have gotten better. The flaws have gotten some kind of like silly putty and tape put over them, but they're still there. And this was another loss. Tetsuya Taira versus Carlos Candelario. Taira looks good. I said that at the start. I think he has two specific Japanese problems. And when I say this Japanese, I mean these are things that tend to be developed on the Japanese regional scene. Nothing about the race itself. Nothing about even the culture. Although maybe the culture. I don't know if the culture plays a role in this. But Japanese regional scene does tend to be a little bit slower paced and a little bit more isolated in terms of there's not necessarily the transitional material to do everything. even though there is the technical know-how to do everything. And if you watch Tyra fight, he's not very smooth in transitioning. Now, he still got the win over Candelario. He still did some good transitions there to get the win. I don't think it's terrible. I don't think it's crippling. But he does fight at a slower rate. He did try to speak a little bit of English today. Does come off as pretty, or not today, but 2 days ago. He does come off as pretty charismatic, and I think there's a potentially big star here. But I think to capitalize on that star, he does need to fight at a faster pace. And he does need to mainstream his game a bit. He needs to embrace what the UFC flyweights are doing. And to that end, I think you should slow play him. I think you should give him someone pretty far down the ladder, maybe like a CJ Vergara. Let him figure some things out. Let him learn lessons in fights that he can still actually win while learning those lessons. And I think that would be the best way to approach it. And for Candelario, he's a good guy to keep around just as kind of like filler. He's a good action fighter. He does everything a little bit reasonably well. Like, he can grapple, he can strike. He's not super physical, but physical enough that he's not going to be a pushover for anyone by any means. He's going to test people regardless of what goes on out there. And maybe you put him in there with Kleitz and Rodriguez and see what happens. My apologies again for the sniffling. Finally, we have Andre Petrovsky submitting Nick Maximo. I'm pretty sure it's Maximoff, and they just go with Maximo to like blend in with the more Hispanic community he grew up in, and also probably to erase some of the negative Russian stereotypiness off his name, because I think his family has been in the States for quite some time, so they would have been there during like the Cold War period. Anyways, for a guy who was claiming that he was the best grappler and everything in the weight class, he got tapped out real hard. Petrovsky kind of embraced the cringe, but like, I'm the best grappler now, and then calling out Gerald Meerschaert, which is a perfectly fine fight, and I'm perfectly happy to see it, and I would book it. The only thing I would disagree is he was like, I know Meerschaert likes to get easy fights in, and I'm like, what easy fights has Gerald Meerschaert ever had? Like, Gerald Meerschaert's level of physicality means that I don't think there's such a thing as an easy fight for him in the UFC. I don't think it exists. So take that and throw that argument away back to where it came from. But yeah, that'd be a fun fight. I still have worries about Petrovsky in terms of like his ability to transition, his ability to fight at a high pace for like an entire 15 minutes, because he does tend to get tired. But he does have a good finishing game. He does have a powerful striking game, and like all the lethality is already there. He just has to be able to put together a style that actually can last a longer chunk of time. Or he needs to finish people in the first round like he did. That's the other option, obviously. And he did that here, and for Maximo, probably a good thing, to be honest, because I think Maximo is a guy who, to a degree, like Petrovsky, and he's younger than Petrovsky, has all the like base building blocks, like a good wrestling game, a good grappling game, a good physicality, a striking game that seems to at least have some decent instincts to it. But at the same time, he's completely relying on changing stances between when he grapples and when he strikes. So, I mean, again, I have no idea how he's developed the style that he's had training with the Diaz brothers. Doesn't fight like a Diaz brother. Doesn't seem to have the strengths that the Diaz brothers coaches tend to produce. So, I don't know, give him more time in the gym. Because it's weird. And that's kind of all I can really say. The next UFC fight night is interesting in the sense that there are actually a lot of fights on here that could be very good, but they're all fights that have a chance to be bad. I mean, obviously any fight has a chance to be bad and has a chance to be a banger, and the percentages there are always present, but it's more that like they're large here and there's a lack of middle ground. There's like, either this is going to really click and give us a really fun fight, or this is not going to click and it's going to be absolutely ugly as hell. And there's like a half dozen fights on this card that fit that bill, and there's not a lot of meaning behind them. This is the Holly Holm versus Ketlin Vieira card. But I am still looking forward to some things. I think Chidi Chikwani and Dusko Tohorovic, that could be good. Ponzinibbio versus Pahea, that could be good. Anders versus Park, that could be good. Holmes versus Amadovsky, that could be good. Morales Medic, that could be good. Martinez versus Morales, that could be good. And that's kind of like all the way down. A lot of fights like that. There are some, I think, somewhat guaranteed stinkers. I'm not looking forward to Polyana Viana versus Tabitha Ricci, for example. I am not really looking forward to Elise Reed versus Sam Hughes. That being said, Elise Reed did kind of prove me a little bit wrong last time out and did some really good things that I wasn't expecting, and maybe she can continue to do those things, and it'll be really, really interesting. Maybe. So, bright side. Think of the positive side. We also had Bellator 281 this week, and that's the Logan Storley Michael Venom Page card. Personally, I scored the fight for Page. I scored rounds 2, 3, and 4 for Page. I think there's an argument that round 1 could also go to Page. Round 5 is the only round that definitively goes to Storley, so that does make me think that he really shouldn't have won. That being said, I think this fight did highlight a lot of problems to both of their games. Storley never seems to be all that comfortable at range, and even his wrestling game kind of doesn't seem built to handle that. And that's a big question. That was a big question coming in, and it's still a big question. MVP is just not really a good grappler, though, and not really good at stopping takedowns. He's actually very good at nullifying your grappling because he'll get the back to the cage, and he's very good at walking on his hands to get back there and forcing that to be a thing and turning the cage into an ally. But on the feet, he's going to give you opportunities to take you down because everything he does is a dash in. And for a guy who's 6'3" and as fast as he is, how he hasn't developed a more, for lack of a better term, Wonder Boy-esque style where he can work the outside and actually pour on some volume and win fights and force you to bring the fight to him and to try to be a little bit more reckless with your grappling is slightly amazing to me. And it's why I've never really been a big fan, because I think that there's a ton of very simple adjustments that he could make that would actually make him a good fighter, and he has either refused or refused to go to the coaching that'll actually give him anything in that regard. So, I don't know. I thought he won, but I also don't really care because I don't view him as a serious fighter. Fabian Edwards knocked out Leota Machida. Not much really to say other than, Machida doesn't really take a great punch at this point, and this is how he's going to kind of lose. I think he's still technically better than a lot of the guys you're going to see him fight in Bellator, quite possibly all of them, but he can just be put physicality can just be put on him. Kenna Watanabe defeated Denise Kyle Hiltz by triangle choke. I personally thought that this was a pretty poor performance from Watanabe, though. In many ways, she was outgrappled. In many ways, she was neutralized. And, of course, she was outstruck, which makes sense. Denise Kyle Hiltz is a very good kickboxer. So, Watanabe's career has been very much can-crushing. And, to a level of that does go a little bit above and beyond. Because there's, I want to say her 8th fight where she's fighting a debuting fighter, and it's just undefeated in 8 fights, debuting fighter. Really shouldn't be happening. Really shouldn't be a thing without some really good reasons. This is an Olympian who's coming into MMA, like a Marco Madsen or something. No. Anyways, I just don't rate her though that high. Paul Daly mostly got beaten up by Wendell Giacomo via grappling and even, to be honest, on the feet a lot, and then didn't knock him out. And says he's going to retire. Paul Daly, see my points about Ryan Spawn, but more specifically that I never understood why Paul Daly did MMA as much as he did. He seems to really enjoy the boxing and kickboxing aspects of combat sports, but he hates grappling. Hates it with a burning passion, like Michael Johnson does, like Robbie Lawler does, and I'm always kind of wondering why they chose MMA as opposed to a different path of combat sports. I do really get it. Simon Biong won by decision. Daniel Weichel knocked out Robert Whiteford. And actually, one of the more interesting fights was Alina Kalindu versus Kate Jackson. Kalindu actually really interests me because she's pretty young. She's 23 years old. She's definitely got a lot of raw physicality to her. Very strong, fast, coordinated. Does everything with a smooth, athletic polish. Is technically an absolute mess and trains with a gym that is not going to fix that in any way. Like, it's not even necessarily a particularly good Greek scene gym. She needs to go somewhere. But if she does, my lord, is there a lot of raw material to work with there. Lordy. No, we're like the way she was able to just absolutely manhandle Kate Jackson from like bad positions and have largely actually a lot of the right instincts for fighting. The only mistake I think she really made that was like a fight IQ moment was when she dropped for the heel hook in the first round. That was a bad idea. But she had also won a fight recently by heel hook, so I kind of understand it. I really didn't rate her before this because I hadn't seen her against someone who I really could gauge the physicality about. And now that I have, I don't know, I'm interested. But she really does need to go places. We got a buggy choke for Oliver Enkamp. It's Mark Lemminger. And then we had essentially some filler. Like Charlie Ward's an okay, exciting, brawling fighter, but it's not a ton there. Not a bad card, but the main event really absolutely sucks the life out of it. And there's not much more to say other than that. Like, that's the problem, is the fight that the Bellator cards tend to be like a very dependent on their main event. And when the main event sucks, it's always going to leave a pretty bad taste in your mouth. And that's kind of really about it. So that's today's show. Not much to talk about beyond that. If you know of a way to get on Spotify without paying money, I'd be very interested, because unfortunately, so, a little dirt here. I joined Acast because they said that it would be free integration with Spotify, and it did not provide that. So there you go. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. See you pretty shortly, because I'll be bringing the UFC predictions to you next episode. Is there any like Bellator stuff coming up? Is it going to be more than just the UFC? Or, wow, it is really just going to be the UFC on the next show. I mean, there's a 1FC card, but 1FC cards tend to be very small and very thin. I'm looking through it. I'm not seeing anything I really want to talk about. So there you go. I mean, Gary Tonon's on the card for a grappling match. That's interesting. But that's kind of about it. So, hope you enjoyed. I'll be back. Maybe I'll think of a topic to like pad out the show and kind of dive deep into one of the issues facing MMA today.